The first thing I noticed after Arthur was gone wasn't the silence. It was the dust. I saw it dancing in the slivers of late afternoon sun, coating the surface of his old mahogany reading desk, settling on the worn leather of his favorite armchair. For 50 years this house had been a living thing, a place of shared breaths and constant motion, but now it felt like a museum to a life that had just ended, and the dust was the only thing moving. My hand hovered over a framed photograph on the desk, the two of us in our 20s grinning on a windswept beach, Arthur's arm thrown around my shoulder, his eyes full of a future he thought was limitless. We built this life from nothing, brick by brick, promise by promise. We adopted our son Ethan and poured all of that future into him. I picked up the frame, my thumb tracing the outline of Arthur's jaw, the glass cold against my skin. The man in the picture was gone, and the boy we raised. Where was he now? Before I let myself fall completely into that memory, a thought for you watching. Let me know in the comments where you're from in the world, what time it is for you. And if stories about family, and the lines that should never be crossed, are something you connect with, please like and subscribe. It means more than you know, and it helps me continue to share these moments. The memory of the beach faded, replaced by the sterile, beeping quiet of the hospital room from yesterday. I had held Arthur's hand, his skin thin as paper, and watched the last light fade from his eyes. It was peaceful, the nurses said. But there is no peace in watching half of your own soul extinguish. There is only a hollow, ringing void where a universe used to be. My gaze drifted from the photograph to the telephone sitting silently on its cradle beside the desk. The receiver felt like it weighed 100 pounds. I had to make the call. I had to tell our son that his father was dead. A part of me, a foolish, hopeful part, imagined Ethan's voice breaking, imagined him saying he'd be on the next flight, that he was coming home. We'd grieve together the way a family is supposed to. We'd hold each other up. But a colder, newer part of me, a part that had been growing for the last few years, felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach. This dread had a name, and her name was Chloe. She had arrived in Ethan's life like a beautiful, invasive vine, slowly, methodically wrapping herself around him until you couldn't tell where he ended and she began. At first I had been happy for him. We both were. Arthur used to say she had a smile that could light up a room, but I always noticed it never quite reached her eyes. Her eyes were calculators, constantly assessing value, position, advantage. I remembered a dinner about a year ago. Arthur had been telling a long, rambling story about a fishing trip from his childhood, his hands gesturing wildly, his voice full of nostalgic joy. I saw Chloe check her phone under the table, her expression one of polite, glass-walled boredom. Ethan caught her eye, and his own smile faltered. He gently cut his father off. "Dad, maybe a shorter version?" he'd said, with a tight little laugh. Arthur's hands dropped to his lap, the light in his eyes dimming. I felt a flash of anger so hot it surprised me, but I said nothing. I didn't want to be the difficult father-in-law. I buried it. But I never forgot it. I should have seen that moment for what it was, not just a small slight, but the first tremor of an earthquake that was shifting the very foundations of our family. But I had wanted to believe in the son we raised, not the man she was shaping. Now, standing in the deafening silence of our home, I knew I couldn't put off the call any longer. What would you have done if you saw those little warning signs? Do you think I was too forgiving, too willing to look the other way? Maybe if I had spoken up then, I wouldn't be standing here alone, terrified of the voice I was about to hear on the other end of the line. The phone felt colder than the photo frame as I lifted it to my ear. My fingers, trembling slightly, punched in the familiar numbers. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, he picked up. "Hey, Dad, what's up?" His voice was bright, airy, distant. It was the voice he used for conference calls for clients, not for his father. There was music in the background, a light jazz melody, the clinking of glasses. My own breath hitched in my throat. I could picture the scene perfectly. Their pristine, minimalist apartment, the one Chloe decorated from a magazine, all white walls and sharp angles, no room for old photographs or dusty memories. They were probably getting ready to go out. "Ethan," I started, and my voice sounded alien, a cracked and weathered thing. I have some news." The music in the background didn't stop. "Is everything okay? You sound weird." There was a hint of impatience in his tone, the slightest edge of annoyance, as if my call was an interruption to a tightly managed schedule. I closed my eyes, picturing Arthur's face, gathering the strength from a memory of his kindness. "It's your father, son. He passed away. Last night. It was quiet. He didn't suffer." The words fell out of me and lay dead in the air between us. I waited for the shock, the grief, the gasp. I waited for the music to be cut short. I waited for my son. Instead, there was a brief pause, a beat of silence that felt more like calculation than sorrow. Then, the most grotesque sound I have ever heard, a cheerful, almost chipper, exhale. "Oh, wow. Okay," he said, his voice completely unchanged, still light, still distant. "Well, listen, I appreciate you letting me know, but today is actually a really big day for us. It's my and Chloe's anniversary." I couldn't breathe. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I must have misheard him. He couldn't have just said that. "What?" I whispered, the sound barely escaping my lips. The word was a ghost. "Yeah," he continued, completely oblivious, his cheerfulness a physical blow. "She's been planning the celebration for months. Everything's booked, you know how she gets. So I really can't deal with anything else right now. We can talk about arrangements or whatever next week. Just not today. Today is my wife's special day." He said it again. Her special day. The phrase echoed in the hollow space Arthur left behind, a grotesque, profane monument to a love I no longer recognized. My husband, his father, was dead, and our son was celebrating. The sound on his end of the line wasn't grief, it wasn't shock. It was the pop of a champagne cork. I heard Chloe laugh in the background, a sound like tiny shattering shards of glass. My mind went blank. The 50 years with Arthur, the skinned knees and bedtime stories, the pride at Ethan's graduation, the toast I gave at his wedding. It all dissolved into a white-hot static of disbelief. I looked back at the photograph on the desk, at the two young men with their whole lives ahead of them, and then at the empty armchair beside it. I remembered a promise Ethan made to Arthur when he was just a boy, after he fell out of a tree and Arthur sat with him all night in the hospital. "I'll always be there for you, Daddy," he had whispered, his small hand gripping Arthur's finger. Promise. I realized, with a clarity that was terrifying, that the promise had died long before Arthur did. The man on the phone was a stranger, a hollowed-out version of my son, replaced by a reflection of his wife's ambition. He wasn't just choosing her over me. He was choosing her over his own father's memory. The line went dead. He had hung up. I stood there, receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone's indifferent hum. The silence in the house was no longer about grief for a life that was over. It was about the sickening, cold certainty of a betrayal that was just beginning. And I knew, standing there in the ruins of my family, that this was not just a moment of callousness. It was a declaration. The dial tone screamed in my ear for a full minute before I had the strength to place the receiver back in its cradle. The click it made was unnervingly final. For a few moments I was adrift in a sea of pure, silent shock, the kind that numbs you from the inside out. My legs gave way and I sank into Arthur's leather armchair, the worn material groaning under my weight. The air still smelled faintly of him, old books and the pipe tobacco he'd given up years ago, but that had somehow seeped into the very fabric of the room. It was a scent that had meant comfort my entire adult life. But now it was an accusation. It smelled like everything I had just allowed to be desecrated. I was a ghost in my own home. I stared at the phone, a black serpent coiled on the desk. What kind of person hears that their father has died and pops a champagne cork? What had we created? What had she created? The question had no answer, only a series of fracturing images. Ethan as a boy crying over a scraped knee. Ethan as a teen struggling with algebra while Arthur patiently sat with him for hours. Ethan as a young man, his face beaming with pride as he accepted his diploma. Where did that person go? Was he ever really there at all? Then the phone rang again. Its shrill, piercing cry shattered the silence, and my heart seized in my chest. A flicker of insane hope ignited within me. It was him. It had to be him. The shock had worn off and he was calling back, his voice thick with shame and grief. He was going to apologize, to break down, to become my son again. My hand trembled as I snatched the receiver. "Ethan," I said, my voice a raw plea. But the voice that answered was not my son's. It was hers. It was Chloe. And it was not warm. "William," she said, her tone as crisp and sterile as a hospital sheet. There was no sympathy, no sorrow, just a faint, well-mannered irritation, as if I were a distant business associate who had missed a deadline. "I'm calling because Ethan is a bit flustered. You've caught him at a very inopportune time." Flustered. That was the word she used. Not devastated, not heartbroken. Flustered. The sound of her voice was different from Ethan's empty cheerfulness. His was a hollow echo of a person. Hers was the source of the emptiness itself. It was surgical. Each word was a perfectly polished, perfectly cold little stone dropped into the silence. "He shouldn't have hung up on you, that was rude," she continued, a parody of an apology. "But you have to understand, the reservations for tonight were made 3 months ago at one of the city's top restaurants. My parents are meeting us there. It's a celebration of our 5-year milestone, and it's tied to a very important networking opportunity for Ethan's career. A partner from his firm will be there." She paused, letting the weight of her infuriating logic settle. Have you ever heard someone try to justify the unjustifiable? To wrap an act of profound cruelty in the mundane language of schedules and networking? It's a special kind of violence. "Your timing is frankly terrible," she said, her voice dropping a fraction, the plastic politeness peeling back to reveal the steel underneath. "Arthur was ill for a long time, William. This wasn't a surprise. We all knew it was coming. To expect us to drop everything, to cancel commitments that affect Ethan's professional standing, over something that was inevitable. It's simply not practical." I was speechless. The audacity of it, the sheer, calculated inhumanity was breathtaking. She was talking about my husband, her father-in-law, as if he were a quarterly report, a predictable market downturn that they had already factored into their business plan. Arthur hadn't been an inevitability. He had been a man who loved her husband, who had welcomed her into his home, who had once spent an entire weekend helping them move into their first apartment, his back aching, without a single complaint. I remembered him saying to me after they'd left, "She measures everything, William, every gift, every favor. It all goes on a balance sheet in her head. Be careful." I hadn't understood the warning then. I had dismissed it as my husband's old-fashioned skepticism. But now, I saw it all. We weren't family to her. We were assets or liabilities. And with his health failing, Arthur had become a liability. His death was just the final closing of a messy account. "Are you still there?" Chloe's voice prodded, sharp and impatient. The numbness in my veins was being replaced by something else, something cold and heavy and hard. It was resolve. I was done being the grieving, gentle old man. That man died with Arthur. "Yes," I said, and my own voice surprised me. It was steady. It was calm. "I am." "Good," she said, misinterpreting my silence as acquiescence. "So here's what will happen. You'll handle the immediate, Necessities. We will fly in for the funeral, of course. We'll need at least a week's notice to clear our schedules. Just email me the date when it's confirmed. We'll be there. We'll look the part. Don't worry. Look the part. The words hung in the air. This was a performance to her. Grief was a costume you put on for a few hours to maintain appearances. And with that, she was done. The transaction was complete. "Goodbye, William," she said, and hung up. I didn't slam the phone down. I placed it gently back in its cradle as if it were a venomous snake I didn't want to startle. The house was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the silence of grief. It was the silence of a coming storm. The last embers of my hope for my son had been extinguished, doused by his wife's practicality. They would come to the funeral and look the part. Fine. But they had no idea what part I was now preparing to play. I pushed myself up from the armchair and walked to Arthur's desk. My hands no longer trembled. They were steady. I had a duty now, not just to grieve my husband, but to protect his legacy from the scavengers he had the misfortune of calling family. I needed to find the paperwork for the funeral home he'd prearranged years ago. He was always so organized. I pulled open the top right drawer, the one that always stuck a little. It was filled with files neatly labeled taxes, insurance, household. I found the one marked final arrangements. But my fingers brushed against something else beneath it. It wasn't a file, it was a thick leather-bound folio, cool to the touch. It felt heavy, important. I had never seen it before in my life. I lifted it out. Embossed on the cover in faded gold leaf were 3 words that made the air freeze in my lungs. 3 words that Arthur must have put there, long ago, as a final, silent warning that I had failed to heed. The folio was labeled, Ethan, Contingency. The leather folio felt alien in my hands, its weight a dense physical secret. Ethan, Contingency. The words weren't a label. They were a verdict, delivered from beyond the grave. My Arthur, the man who planned our finances with meticulous spreadsheets and organized his tools in perfect, gleaming rows, had prepared for this. He had seen the rot setting in long before I had been willing to admit it, and he had created a failsafe, a contingency. My fingers, now clumsy with a sudden, nervous energy, fumbled with the clasp. For a moment I hesitated. Opening this felt like a betrayal of its own, an admission that the son we had loved and raised was a problem to be managed, a risk to be mitigated. But Chloe's voice, sharp and cold as an icicle, echoed in my mind. "Your timing is frankly terrible." I opened the folio. Inside, it wasn't a single document, but a collection of them, all held together by a thick rubber band. On top was a handwritten letter, penned in Arthur's familiar, elegant cursive. My breath caught in my throat. It was dated 6 months ago, during his last stay in the hospital. I unfolded the crisp paper, the faint scent of his aftershave still clinging to it, a ghost in the fibers. "My dearest William," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and I am sorry you are facing what comes next alone. Forgive me for not showing you this while I was alive. A part of me hoped I would be wrong, that the boy we raised would find his way back. Hope, I've learned, can be a dangerous thing. It can blind you to the truth you see with your own eyes." My eyes stung with tears, blurring the words. I wiped them away impatiently. This was not the time for grief. It was the time for understanding. I continued reading. I saw the change in Ethan the day he met her. He started measuring his life not in happiness but in milestones. Not in love but in acquisitions. She didn't corrupt him, William. That's too simple. She validated a weakness that was already there. She gave his ambition a voice, and that voice has drowned out everything else, including his heart. He is not our son anymore. He is her project, and we, my love, have become inconvenient loose ends. The honesty of his words was a punch to the gut. He had seen it all, every subtle shift, every cold calculation I had dismissed as a quirk of her personality. I felt a wave of regret so powerful it almost buckled my knees. Why hadn't I listened? Why hadn't I seen? I thought back to every awkward family dinner, every conversation that felt like an interview, every gift that was acknowledged with a polite, transactional thank you. Do you think I was too forgiving here? I ask myself that now, 1,000 times a day. Maybe my love for my son was a kind of blindness, a refusal to see the man he was becoming because I was too attached to the memory of the boy he had been. The letter went on, his script growing slightly less steady toward the end. I have not done this out of anger, but out of a duty to protect what we built, the life we made together, the home you are sitting in, the security I worked my entire life to provide for you. These things are not hers to inherit. They are not his to squander. They are yours. The documents in this folio will ensure that. Follow the instructions from our attorney, Mr. Davies. He has known my intentions for over a year. Trust him. He will guide you. Be strong, my love. The storm is here. Don't let them wash away our legacy. Your loving husband, Arthur. Beneath the letter were the documents. Financial statements, copies of deeds, and at the very bottom, a freshly revised last will and testament, signed and notarized. I didn't need to read it. I knew what it would say. Arthur had disinherited him, not with a grand, angry gesture, but with the quiet, devastating precision of a surgeon excising a tumor. He had cut Ethan out of our life's work, not to punish him, but to protect me. I sank back into the armchair, the folio in my lap, the weight of Arthur's foresight both a comfort and a terrible burden. He had left me a shield, but he had also left me a sword. The decision to use it was mine alone. The memorial service was my next thought. Chloe had demanded a week's notice. Fine. She wanted to look the part. I would give her a stage on which to perform. I picked up the phone and called the funeral home. I set the date for 3 days from now. Not a week. Not on their schedule. On mine. Then I called our attorney, Mr. Davies, a quiet, methodical man I'd known for 30 years. I explained the situation, my voice low and steady. I told him about Ethan's reaction, about Chloe's call, about the folio. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with a weary sadness. "I am so sorry for your loss, William," he said softly. "And I am sorry that Arthur's fears have come to pass. He was a good man. He wanted to ensure you were never at their mercy." "What do I do now?" I asked. "For now you do nothing," Davies advised. "You grieve. You hold the service. You let them play their parts. The will cannot be read until after the death certificate is issued. Let them believe everything is as they expect it to be. Let them walk into the room with their heads held high. The truth will be waiting for them when the time is right." His words were calm, logical. It was sound advice. But as I hung up the phone, a different idea began to form in my mind. A cold, hard seed of an idea planted by Chloe's callousness. Why should they be allowed to perform their false grief in peace? Why should they be allowed to stand before our friends and family and pretend to mourn a man they had so callously dismissed? Arthur deserved better than that. He deserved genuine sorrow, not a networking opportunity. An image flashed in my mind. The sight of Chloe's perfectly composed face, her eyes dry and assessing, as she stood by a graveside. The thought of her using Arthur's memorial as a backdrop for her social climbing filled me with a quiet, burning rage. They wanted to look the part? I decided in that moment that I would write the script for their performance myself. I went back to Arthur's desk, but this time I didn't look at the folio. I pulled out a fresh piece of stationery and a pen. I began to write the eulogy for my husband. But this would be no ordinary eulogy. It wouldn't be a gentle walk through fond memories. It would be a story about love, loyalty, and promises, both the ones that are kept and the ones that are broken. It would be a tribute to Arthur, yes, but it would also be something else. It would be a mirror, held up in front of our son and his wife, in a room full of people who had known and respected Arthur for decades. And I would make sure that the reflection it showed them was one they could never, ever forget. The quiet dread that had filled the house was gone. In its place was a sharp, focused clarity. The memorial was in 3 days, and I had work to do. I remember when Ethan was 12, standing in front of the hallway mirror, fumbling with the silk tie I had bought him for his grandfather's funeral. His fingers were all thumbs, the knot a tangled mess. Arthur had been gone for hours, handling the arrangements, and it fell to me to teach our son this small, solemn ritual of manhood. I stood behind him, my hands guiding his, showing him how to loop the fabric, pull it through, and tighten it into a neat, respectable Windsor knot. "You do this to show respect, son," I'd told him, my voice gentle. Enter text. The 6 weeks that followed the memorial were a study in silence. A thick, suffocating blanket of it settled over the house, a quiet so profound it felt louder than any argument. There were no calls from Ethan, no emails from Chloe. It was as if their public humiliation had cauterized the final frayed connection between us, leaving nothing but a scar. I spent the days sorting through Arthur's things, not with the frantic energy of grief, but with a slow, methodical deliberation. Each object, a worn tweed jacket, a dog-eared book of poetry, a tin box of old fishing lures, was a piece of a life well lived, a life they had deemed an inconvenience. I was not just cleaning a house, I was curating a legacy, protecting it from those who saw it only as a line item on a balance sheet. Then the call came from Mr. Davies. His voice was calm, formal. "The death certificate has been issued, William. We can proceed. I have scheduled the reading of the will for tomorrow at 10 a.m. I have already sent the summons." He didn't need to say who to. The next morning I walked into his office 5 minutes early. The room was exactly as I remembered it from decades of signing mortgages and planning estates. Walls lined with leather-bound books that no one ever read. A heavy mahogany desk polished to a mirror shine, and 2 plush leather chairs facing it. The air smelled of old paper and money. It was a room built for consequences. I sat, my back straight, my hands resting on my knees, and I waited. I felt a strange calm, the serene certainty of a man who knows he is merely the executor of a final, unassailable truth. I was an instrument of Arthur's last wish. They arrived precisely at 10. Ethan strode in first, his face a mask of bored obligation. He was wearing a suit so sharply tailored it looked like armor. Behind him was Chloe, her expression a careful blend of somberness and impatience. She offered me a curt, professional nod, her eyes sweeping the room, assessing its value. They did not apologize. They did not ask how I was. They took their seats as if they were arriving for a business meeting where the outcome was a foregone conclusion. They believed the eulogy was my final, petty revenge, a spasm of grief. They had no idea it was only the overture. Mr. Davies entered, a thin folio in his hand, and the atmosphere in the room tightened. He sat behind his desk, the polished wood a barrier between us all. He cleared his throat. "We are gathered today for the formal reading of the last will and testament of Arthur Miller," he began, his voice a dry rustle of paper. "This document was signed and notarized on March 12th of this year, at which time I, and 2 other witnesses, found Mr. Miller to be of perfectly sound mind and body." He paused, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second on Chloe, who had already opened her mouth as if to protest. She closed it with a snap. Davies then began to read through the initial legal clauses, the standard boilerplate language that opens every will. I watched them. Ethan was tapping his expensive shoe on the Persian rug, a rhythmic, impatient beat. Chloe had her purse clutched in her lap, her knuckles white. They were waiting for the numbers. They were waiting for their payday. "And now," Mr. Davies said, his tone shifting slightly, "we come to the primary bequests. Before the formal distribution, Arthur wished for a personal note to be read aloud." He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Ethan. "This is for you, my son," he read. Arthur's words filling the sterile office with a sudden, shocking intimacy. "I have spent my life believing that the greatest inheritance a father can leave is not money, but character. integrity, a sense of loyalty that withstands the tests of convenience. For years I watched as the values we taught you were eroded, replaced by a hollow ambition that prizes perception over substance. I hoped you would find your way back. But your father is not a stock to be sold, nor is his memory a meeting to be rescheduled. A man is defined by where he stands when it matters most. And when it mattered most, you were not there. Ethan's tapping stopped. The color began to drain from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxy sheen. Chloe's lips thinned into a bloodless white line. The room was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Davies turned to the next page. Therefore, he continued, his voice returning to its formal, legal cadence, regarding the distribution of my estate, the terms are as follows. To my beloved son, Ethan Miller, I leave the sum of $1, to be paid upon request, as a final accounting of the value he placed upon our relationship. The words landed in the silence like stones dropped into a deep well. $1. It wasn't just disinheritance, it was a judgment. It was a price tag. I watched Chloe's face. The mask didn't just crack, it shattered. For the first time I saw raw, unfiltered emotion in her eyes. Not grief, not anger, but the pure, panicked fury of a gambler who has just lost everything on a final, certain bet. Her calculating eyes were finally seeing a number they couldn't process. Ethan was frozen, his face a canvas of disbelief. He looked as if he'd been physically struck. All remaining assets, Davies's voice continued, relentless and steady, including all properties, liquid assets, investment portfolios, and personal effects, totaling an estimated value of $7,200,000. I leave in their entirety to my husband and partner of 50 years, William Miller. He is the sole beneficiary. This decision is final and is not to be contested. The silence that followed was a living thing. It was thick with the death of expectation, with the ashes of their carefully constructed future. Some might call what Arthur did cruel. But standing there, watching the foundation of their world turn to dust, I had to ask myself, was it cruelty, or was it the final, necessary consequence of their own actions? Chloe was the first to break. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "This is absurd," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "He was a sick old man. You manipulated him. We will fight this in court until you have nothing left." But I wasn't looking at her. My eyes were locked on my son. He slowly rose to his feet, his movements stiff, robotic. His face was no longer pale with shock. It was flushed with a deep, ugly red. He didn't look at the lawyer. He didn't look at his wife. He looked at me. And in his eyes I saw no remorse, no flicker of understanding, no dawning horror at what he had done. I saw only blame. Pure, undiluted blame. "You did this," he whispered, his voice a low, venomous rasp. "All these years, you were jealous. You were always jealous of her, of what we had. You poisoned him against me." He took a step toward the desk, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. The love I had held for him my entire life evaporated in that moment, replaced by a cold, desolate clarity. Arthur was right. The boy I had raised was gone. This stranger standing before me was nothing more than her final failed project. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face twisted into a mask of righteous fury. "This isn't over," he snarled. "This is war." "This is war," he snarled, and the words hung in the sterile air of the office, thick and poisonous. For a heart-stopping moment I saw not my son, but a cornered animal, all bared teeth and raw, misplaced fury. His declaration of war wasn't against me. It was against the consequences of his own choices. He had planted a field of salt and was now enraged that nothing would grow. Chloe stood beside him, a general surveying a lost battle, her mind already calculating legal fees, public perception, and the quickest route to appeal. She placed a hand on his arm, not for comfort, but for control. "We're leaving," she announced to the room, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "You'll be hearing from our lawyer." I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I simply watched them turn, two synchronized figures of righteous indignation, and walk out of the room. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them, the sound echoing the finality of the receiver clicking down in its cradle all those weeks ago. It was truly over. Mr. Davies let out a long, slow breath, the first sign of tension he had shown. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a weary sympathy. "I'm sorry you had to endure that, William." I shook my head, a strange sense of peace settling over me. The storm had finally broken. "Arthur knew this would happen," I said, my voice steady. "He prepared me for it." "He prepared for more than you know," Davies said, a cryptic edge to his tone. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the leather-bound folio, the one labeled Ethan Contingency. He slid it across the polished desk toward me. "They will contest it, William. Chloe is tenacious and Ethan is now desperate. They will claim you exerted undue influence, that Arthur was not of sound mind. They will drag his name, and yours, through the mud." I looked down at the folio. I thought I already knew its contents, the will, the letter. But Davies tapped a finger on the cover. "Arthur's letter was for you," he explained. "The will was the first line of defense. But the true contingency, the real reason they have already lost this war, is in here." He opened it, bypassing the documents I had already seen, and pulled out a single, sealed manila envelope. My name was written on the front, in Arthur's hand. The texture of the paper was thick, official, cool to the touch. Inside I found a legal document, several pages long, clipped together. But it wasn't a will or a trust. It was a business contract, dated 2 years prior. At the top, it read, "Loan and Forbearance Agreement." I scanned the dense paragraphs of legalese, my mind slowly piecing together the story they told. It was a record of a loan for $250,000 from Arthur Miller to Ethan Miller. It was for Ethan's startup venture, a disastrous tech company that had burned through cash before quietly collapsing within a year. I remembered it now. Ethan had been panicked, on the verge of bankruptcy. Chloe had called it a temporary liquidity issue. Arthur had given him the money without a word to me. He'd simply said he was handling it. I thought it had been a gift, but it wasn't. It was a transaction, and it came with a price far greater than interest. My eyes fell on a specific clause, Section 4B. My breath caught in my chest. It was a forbearance clause. In exchange for Arthur forgiving the entire debt, classifying the $250,000 as a gift to save Ethan from financial ruin and professional embarrassment, Ethan had agreed to a single devastating condition. He had willingly, and with his own signature, waived any and all future rights to contest the details of his father's estate. He had, in effect, accepted this money as his final full inheritance, 2 years before his father had even passed away. Do you believe a person can change? Or was he always this way, willing to trade his future for a quick fix? He had sold his birthright for $250,000, and in his arrogance he had forgotten he'd ever made the sale. At the bottom of the last page were 2 signatures. One was Arthur's, strong and clear. The other, unmistakably, was Ethan's, a confident, arrogant scrawl. Chloe's signature was there too, as a witness. They had signed it. They had both signed it. They had cashed the check and forgotten the cost. This wasn't a defense against their claims. It was an annihilation of them. Any lawsuit they filed would be dismissed before it began, and they would be exposed not as grieving children, but as fraudsters. Mr. Davies simply nodded. Arthur called it the receipt, he said quietly. He hoped he would never have to use it, but he was a practical man. He knew his son. Several weeks after that meeting, after Davies had sent a certified copy of the receipt to the lawyer Chloe had hired, a package arrived at my door. It was a thick document from my attorney. There was no rage, no threats of war. There was only the quiet, rustling sound of unconditional surrender. They had withdrawn their contest. They had been checkmated by a man who was already gone. I sat in Arthur's armchair, the legal papers resting on my lap, and I looked around the room. The dust motes still danced in the afternoon sun, but the house no longer felt like a museum. The silence was no longer a void. It was peace. It was mine. The son I had raised was gone, and the grief for that loss was a separate, quieter sorrow I would carry with me always. But the man he had become, the stranger who had chosen an anniversary over a memorial, had no power here anymore. He had no claim on this life, this home, this legacy. He had made his choice on that special day, and this was the consequence. I had kept my promise to Arthur. Our life's work was safe. The final letter I received was not from a lawyer. It was a single handwritten page from Ethan, arriving a month later. There was no apology. There was no remorse. It was a desperate, rambling plea for money, filled with accusations and self-pity, ending with the question, "How could you do this to your only son?" I folded the letter, walked to the fireplace, and watched it turn to gray ash, the words disappearing into the quiet air. It's true what they say. The opening is everything. A life, a relationship, a family. It all comes down to a few critical moments, the choices we make when we think no one is keeping score. Some people believe inheritance is about money and property, the things you leave behind. But Arthur taught me the truth. A true inheritance is the character you build, the loyalty you show, and the promises you keep. It's the one thing that can't be bought, sold, or signed away in a contract. It is earned in the quiet moments, and it is revealed in the storm. If this story resonated with you, and you believe in the power of consequences, let me know in the comments by writing the word justice. And please subscribe so you don't miss the next story. There is always more to tell.